Finally, we are looking at melee in raid. It's been a while and the melees are actually doing a lot of damage in the raid, but not consistently because some melees suck and some melees don't. But which is which? Let's take a look, because in the end they're all better than us anyway. But nobody cares about that. People just care about S tier. And speaking of S tier, that is not where ARMS is going. Actually, ARMS is gonna go all the way into a B tier. A B tier. Actually, to be fair, ARMS is rising slowly on the performance rankings, and we don't really have the full picture of Mythic when it comes to all of these logs. I think guilds have already gone to the most at Silken Court, and not everybody's actually at Silken Court at the moment. I mean, Silken Court doesn't have representation of all of the melee specs, which, you know, puts some melees into the bottom. And ARMS is very good at Silken Court. By the way, it's actually obviously excels at 2-target, considering that its sweeping swipes playstyle is actually the bread and butter of the fantasy of the spec, which is a sin, but we're not going to talk about that today. However, overall, it doesn't really have amazing shining moments. It's not a bad spec, obviously. B tier is where we're going to have, you know, this fight is really good for this spec, like Silken Core for ARMS, but in all the other fights, it's kind of like, it's good that we have an ARMS, but it's not going to blow everybody's mind. I'm done talking about ARMS, because the next one on the list is... Hey man, you know that's bad for you, right?
Shut up, man. I really want you, okay?
It's not about what you want. It's about what you need. And you need Fume. That's the stuff. Fume is the healthy alternative to a bad habit and the leader in the flavored air category, which is quickly becoming more and more popular. Fume is a flavored air device that lets you engage in similar mannerism without the unhealthy side effects. Fume is not a vape. No actual vapor or nicotine of any kind is used, so there is no addiction to worry about. It actually uses non-toxic flavors to make drawing from it an actual delight. Check this out. And I enjoy the crispy mint flavor since I am a chewing gum aficionado, and using it from Fume is actually super refreshing and is tasty the right word to describe it? Either way, Fume does an amazing job at replacing micro habits like the need to hold something in between your fingers and bring it to your mouth with a legit focus on the safety of the user. They continuously invest in third-party studies regarding safety measures, not to mention that the product and its use is backed up by physicians as well. The device is not electric, no batteries involved, and has a slick and elegant design that makes it a pleasure to hold in your hand. It also comes with a reusable, rewashable topper that you can place over the mouthpiece. This gives it a softer feel when you're using it, making it for a more relaxing and more comfortable experience, especially since it's chewable for those of us who love to fidget. You can just slip it over the mouthpiece and donezo! Fume is the sponsor of our video today, for which we are grateful. It has served over 300,000 customers and you can be next. Simply head on over to tryfume.com, you can see the link on the screen as well, by the way, and use our code MarceliOn for a free topper when you order your journey pack, or simply scan the QR code on the screen for the same result. Thank you, Fume, for sponsoring our video. Assassination is also kind of like ARMS, just a bit better statistically at the moment. It has fights like, I believe, Mythic Roshanon, where it's just destroying, and it's also a particularly difficult spec to rank, because as opposed to ARMS, where it's very clear where ARMS shines, is essentially 2 targets, it's a very consistent spec. The way Assassination does damage is a little bit more complicated with how its cooldowns work and how you build up to those big moments of damage dealing, and just so happens to work really well with Roshanon. I really want to see how all of these will rank up in the end once we have, I guess, Hall of Fame completed and everybody has cleared, well, everybody that's anybody has cleared Mythic and Strike, because right now obviously there's nobody at Mythic and Strike as opposed to Race of War First, which obviously they have done. And, you know, even the logs that we have right now for half of the Mythic raid are a little bit scuffed. There's like 2 or 3 of one particular spec, and they're all inflated with power infusions, and they do a lot more than specs that are probably better than them at the rest of the raid. As it stands, I'm not necessarily ashamed of putting Assassination into A tier because it does have very good damage overall and has shining moments, and it's likely the best rogue spec that you're going to have. And if you will want to have a rogue spec, and you kind of maybe do for atrophic poison and stuff like that, it's very nice to have, then you're most likely going to get an Assassination Rogue. It might still be close to B tier as well, but I'm going to keep it in A because it deserves a little bit of love. Bias? Not really. It's fine. It's A tier for now. Outlaw, however, is one of the first losers of this tier. I'm gonna put it all the way into C tier. It's not necessarily a bad spec. It's not amazing either. Obviously, people are clearing mythic bosses with Outlaw. It cannot be that bad if it's clearing mythic bosses, the hardest content that you can actually do as a raider, of course. But compared to the other melees, which is how we're actually doing this tier list, because we see people saying that, why is this in B tier? It should be A tier. Well, if we're going to be very honest with Outlaw, considering that when it comes to just raw damage, when all else is equal, most of the specs are A tier, right? Once again, if we just do that, there's no specs in C and D tier. The game is decently balanced at the moment to the point where anybody can play anything, okay? But that just makes it for a more boring video. There is a difference between Outlaw and the rest of the specs, and that difference is that it's one of the specs that has not cleared Silken Court at the moment, I believe, and it might actually do by the time you watch this video, but that doesn't matter. It's, you know, in the progression of clearing the content, Outlaw is behind almost all of the melee specs. One spec it is not behind, and that is survival, which is more, it's survival is behinder than Outlaw, since I think survival isn't even at either Overnax or Princess. I know we have some data that shows up on the screen, which our boy Mokti does a good job at showing you, but survival has one less boss cleared than Outlaw, which is why it's going into D tier. Overall, they're very similar in the performance. They could have well just be in the same tier, but people like to look at mythic logs for performance, even though they're very incomplete, and this ranking will show you why they're incomplete and why it's not that great to look at mythic logs before enough people manage to actually clear the raid properly. But as it stands, it is one boss behind Outlaw, and Outlaw is one boss behind the rest of the melee specs, so that's where you get C and D tier. It's a sad day for survival. Who knows? By the way, listen, next week, because you're watching this Friday, next week we're gonna have the reset on 11.05, and survival is getting all sorts of goodies coming into the spec. Affects more AoE, to be fair, but it will see, I believe, a resurgence in the survival performance, maybe even opposed to the other Hunter specs, considering that most of the hard fights in this raid, Ansurek and Overnax, for instance, are AoE fights, and you need those big AoE fights. But we're actually gonna move on to Enhancement. Who is the quintessential king of this tier? Is it the solo reigning king of Nerebar Palace? We'll have to see until we get through the other melees, unless you skip the video. Don't skip the video! Please don't skip the video! You're hurting the algorithm. But Enhancement is the most consistent spec across the board. There are specs like, for instance, Frost DK, which we'll get to in a second, that do better than Enhancement on particular fights, but Enhancement is just consistently at the top, which is incredible to see, because it has been a similar situation with Enhancement back in Dragonflight, where it was just really, really good pretty much everywhere. I don't know if we have all of the rankings for all of the bosses in Heroic, because that's the most consistent one. We see Enhancement almost S tier in all of the bosses through sheer damage output, of course. That's probably inflated by PIs and augmentations and all of that, but it is there as opposed to other melee specs. And even in mythic bosses, it is, I think, at worst A tier at the moment, which is really good and definitely deserving of the S tier. Feral is not sharing in the same love as Enhancement. It is a B tier spec. It was very close to making it into a C tier because it doesn't really have any redeeming fights, as opposed to Arms, which does. Feral does not, but Feral is still doing more bosses than Outlaw, and that's kind of like the main difference between them at the moment. In terms of damage, to be fair, all specs are pretty well balanced in terms of pure single target. AoE is when things kind of change for a bunch of the specs, and we're gonna get to them really soon after Feral. But Feral just doesn't really have any redeeming factor. It's a solid good spec. It's a solid B. That's as much as I can give it at the moment. And now for probably the first controversial placement. A lot of people want to see Frost DK into S tier. Well, that's too bad. I'm not putting it into S tier. And I have a good reason for it. It's not as good as Enhancement overall in terms of statistics. It's a very good spec. I might want a Frost DK in my raid before I want my enhancement for sure, and that might alone be putting it S tier, but I'm, you know, kind of not really deciding on whether or not it's S tier or not. It's the numbers, it's, you know, people are playing it, they're doing really well, but not consistently as high as enhancement. And even if we look at, I don't know, the overall performance of 95 percentiles and even max percentiles of players, you will see enhancement on almost all of the rankings way above, well, decently above Frost DK, where it's kind of hard to put them in the same tier, which is why Frost Death Knight is at the top of the A tier. To be fair, if we had like infinite tiers, we would have probably Survival into S tier, Frost DK into A tier, and then everybody else like a tier behind. Just to kind of, you know, give Frost credit where credit is due. Now, Fury is one that is a little bit harder to place. Fury has, of course, dropped in terms of performance after the multiple nerfs, and that is very sad to see. It is B tier because it definitely excels in AoE fights like Ansrek and Bloodtwister Ovenax. Those are very good fights where you really need the AoE. There are, of course, other fights with AoE like Rashanan and Old Grax as well, but those are kind of like the beginning of the raid. Pretty much anybody can, you know, do enough AoE to clear the ads. Ads are not really a problem there. They become a problem later on. Although I'm not sure how much of a problem they are on Ansrek anyway. But there are ads and they do have to die. Fury does really well on those fights and has done consistently throughout the tier. But it still has one glaring problem, and that is its boss damage. If you look at this particular ranking where we looked at the specs, I think it's only heroic, ranked by the damage that they do to bosses. Fury is very low, like the worst melee at boss damage period, which is what you get from the nerfs that we've had, and not enough single target buffs, not even by a long shot at this point anyway. Who knows what the future will hold. It's not C tier like Outlaw because obviously it's doing way better, but it cannot get A tier. It would have been A tier if it had more boss damage. I think that would have been fair. Havoc is kind of like Feral, although maybe a little bit better. It has some fights where it seems to be doing decent, especially in some of the early Mythic fights, but Mythic is way too early to tell, but it's just not exciting in any way, and that's kind of B tier. You either excel at some fights and kind of suck at others, or you're just consistently good across the board, which makes sense for a middle of the pack tier like B. I cannot really think of anything amazing that Havoc does. You do have some good cooldowns, but there are some mechanics, for instance, like Ansrek, where you're kind of borked by the roots. It's very hard to play your full inertia type playstyle in some of the fights with so many overlapping circles. I'm thinking, I don't know how I would play Havoc at Rashanan when there's like a square in which you have to stay, because otherwise you just touch webs or touch pools or pool ads or anything like that, which makes it a particularly difficult raid for Havoc to participate in. It does have its upsides. I can see it being really good on fights like Sikron, especially if you have to put down the clones and then do the decimates and all of that stuff. But up until then, it's just a solid B tier. Red is kind of like Havoc, but actually good, and it's all the way into A tier. Red is just, it's like the enhancement of the A tier. It's just consistently good across the board. No matter where you look, at the worst, you might see Red in B tiers just because some specs are just degenerate. But overall, Red is just very solid at boss damage, at AoE damage. Red can do it all. It's one of the most complete classes across the board. Like, I don't know if it's good to say, if it's fair to say that it's a more complete melee than Enhancement, because Enhancement is just overall better. I think it might be better overall as a design because you have more defensives, more utility that you bring to the group than maybe an Enhancement does. It just doesn't have the damage of Enhancement, which is what's propping Enhancement so high in the tier list. And I don't even know if it's above or below Frost DK. I'm gonna keep it slightly behind because Frost DK does actually have S tier level fights where it's at. I don't know if we have any fights where Red Paladin is currently S tier, so which is kind of why we're keeping it a little bit behind. But in terms of like if you want to take a universal approach and you want to make the average between these two, they're probably equal in terms of overall value that they bring to the raid, maybe. But it's really good for Red. Subtlety is yet another B tier spec. It's average, it's okay, I don't know if it's on front or behind Havoc, maybe put it behind Havoc. It's been seeing more and more play kind of recently. The buffs that it has coming to it don't feel like they're gonna make any change in how it overall performs. It's gonna be losing Shadow Dust, the talent that reduces the cooldown of your talent in 1105, and some changes to, I believe, Symbols of Death. I don't know how that will affect the performance of Subtlety and Raid. I guess we'll have to just come back in about, I don't know, maybe a month to see where it lands, but right now it's just good. It's good. Not as good as some of the other B tier specs, but hey, it's no Outlaw, I'll tell you that much. Unholy is also not an Outlaw, and Unholy is a little bit more of a wild card than, let's say, Frost Death Knight is. It's probably as wild as Assassination, but maybe slightly better on AoE fights. It's just like, I think on Ovanax right now, as of looking at this, it's the king of AoE fights. It even crushes Frost Death Knight. Marcelian obviously is playing Unholy and he does amazing in the raids, and with my limited knowledge of Frost and Unholy, if I would have to do like consistent AoE fights, I would be more comfortable on Unholy, considering that I'm not tied that much to Breath of Sindragosa, but that doesn't seem to stop Frost Death Knights anyway. But as far as Unholy goes, has solid boss damage, really good AoE, it's a DK that you definitely want in a raid. It's hard to make Unholy look good when Frost is just there, just taking all the spotlight. But if we lived in a world where Frost wouldn't exist, it's very likely that we would see Unholy on top of the A tier instead of Frost. That's how good I believe Unholy is. We'll have to see how things progress. And last but not least, on a little bit of an anticlimactic point, Windwalker is also kind of B tier-ish. Once again, I like these last three B tier specs. I have no idea which one is better than the other. You can just like swap them any time of the day and still be right 50% of the time. It's fine. I'm wrong. I'm gonna put it at the bottom of the B tier. I just remembered I was looking at some of the rankings. I could barely see Windwalker climb to the top of the B tier, not even A tier. I don't think there's a single fight that Windwalker is A tier at. Once again, very close to Outlaw. The only reason why it's not even, I think there are fights where Outlaw is better than Windwalker, but Windwalker is taking in all of the fights so far. It has logged Silken Court as of recording this video, so that's the edge that it has over Outlaw at the moment, not necessarily in damage. To be fair, I don't know how many monks you're gonna have in your raid, and if you do have a monk, the first one might just be a Windwalker. I don't know if Mistweavers are shining or bringing anything amazing to a group where you would want a Mistweaver over Windwalker, so that's probably why it's also in B tier. And this is just melee in raids. In Mythic Plus, it's a slightly different story, although you'll probably see the same contenders, and you can check our video on it right here, which we've published last week. And once again, thank you Fume for sponsoring this video.